Middle's checked in. Can you guys hear me in the back okay? Thank you. All right. If you would, please find a seat. Now, I'm not sure where everyone's supposed to be. There's been a little bit of confusion. Teens are supposed to be where?
In the fellowship hall.
In the fellowship hall. Teens in the fellowship hall. Not that you can't be here. You could. But you'll probably enjoy your Sunday morning much better if you went to the fellowship hall. All right. Well, welcome to Sunday morning class. To our visitors, chaperones, and parents of our youth rally, welcome. You're in the middle of a study on Isaiah. And let's go through a quick catch me up so that you're not completely confused by the content today. Today we're going to be looking at Isaiah 44. So if you've got your Bibles, go ahead and open up to Isaiah 44. We're going to be studying out of that. We're also going to be studying a little bit out of Genesis, a little bit out of Psalms, but we'll do that ad hoc. But keep your finger at Isaiah 44. We're going to be studying about the choice between gods and idols. That's the lesson. Just as review, in previous chapters we've looked at, we've had explanations or writings from Isaiah talking about God returning to Jerusalem. We mentioned God's boardroom, the angels, the heavenly bodies, heavenly beings that are going to be ushering in God back into Jerusalem after the repentance of the kingdom of Judah, and how these heavenly bodies, heavenly beings are going to be lowering the mountains and raising the valleys and getting ready for God to return to Jerusalem. And God is going to be returning to Jerusalem in triumph. He's going to be returning to Jerusalem with all of his reward, all of his plunder, so to speak, coming before him. We talked about the verdict. The verdict kind of hints at who God defeated. The verdict was that God is much better than idols. Nothing can compare to God, especially idols. And that's who God has been triumphant against, is the idols. Think about it. For ever since God's installed, I'm a software developer, so I use words like installed. So ever since God's installed the Israelites into the kingdom of Canaan, he's been battling for the hearts and minds of the people against idols. And we have this verdict from God that he is greater than any idol. No idol can compare to God. We talked about the servant last week specifically. We talked about how King Cyrus is this servant. He's the king of Persia. He conquered Mesopotamia, Babylon, and a couple other kingdoms to make, at the time, the largest kingdom, the largest empire of the period. And he is going to bring glory to God by allowing the kingdom of Judah to return back to their homeland, back to Cana, to rebuild the wall and rebuild the temple. Brother Kim last week had a good question. He mentioned that the servant is described as being gentle, about not a bruised reed will he break. But later on in that same passage that we studied last week, it talked about how God was a warrior. God would be triumphant, that he'd crush his enemies. And how do we reconcile these two things? It's the fact that we've got two different people. We've got the servant and we've got God. The servant is going to be gentle in returning the people back to Jerusalem, but God, he's jealous. God plans on crushing his enemies. In this specific instance, we're talking about idols and idol worship. And so we get to our passage in chapter 44. And before we jump into the verse, let's talk about my history with this verse specifically and with idols. I don't have a history with idols. I've never made any. Not explicitly for worship. There might be some that I've put up before myself, maybe my job. Never really had a car that I thought was an idol. But the passage we're looking at today in chapter 44, I know it's probably rare. Are there any passages in your life that you remember their first hearing? You know the time and the place of its hearing? You know the person who spoke it to you? You know what you were about to do? Because chapter 44 is one of those verses for me. Chapter 44 is a verse that I can tell you, the week. I can't tell you the exact day. I can tell you the week I heard it. I could tell you where I was. I could tell you who read it to me and what we were about to go do. Okay? And a lot of the visual images that I'm going to be showing you today in our slides pertain to that experience for me. As some of you know, I used to live in Japan. I lived in Japan for about 3 years. That's where I met my Canadian wife. It's weird. I go all the way to Canada to meet my wife, or all the way to Japan to meet my wife, and she's Canadian. We taught English in Japan together, but before I was in Japan vocationally, I was in Japan as a student. And it was 2001. It was in October, actually September of 2001. You guys probably know where you were September 11th, 2001. I can tell you right now, I was in an internet cafe in China. And we found out the Twin Towers were bombed, and me and 19 of my classmates huddled around a TV in our hotel room and tried to discern in Chinese what was going on to our country. It was a scary time to be abroad, scary time to be away from your loved ones, away from your countrymen. But at the end of September, after getting done with China, me and my classmates, I was abroad for a semester, by the way, so about 20 students from Oklahoma Christian and a professor of accounting all went abroad in the Pacific Rim. And in October, we were going to spend a month in Japan. So the very first week of October, and I know it was the very first week because we spent the entire month in October and we left on Halloween. And I remember dressing up for Halloween and saying my goodbyes to all my new Japanese friends. But October 1st, we decided to go to Nikko, Japan. This is the Red Bridge in Nikko, Japan. Just to give you some history, when I was a student in Japan, so this is the first time I went a second time as a college student, spent a year in an exchange program, got to meet a lot of great university students. I was on the basketball team, which is something I never expected to do in college, but in Japan, I was great at basketball. In my studies in Japan, the second time around as an exchange student, what's interesting is I found a history of the churches of Christ on the eastern seaboard of Japan, the eastern coast. And come to find out, during World War II, our country did a lot of firebombing of the eastern coast of Japan. Just because their buildings are made of wood, to decimate their economy, we burned a lot of their factories, a lot of their homes. What's interesting, and I actually talked to Nolan about this last week, is in reading this history of the Churches of Christ in Japan, a lot of Churches of Christ, once the war was over and we began to occupy Japan, Churches of Christ would gather collections and send donations of rice to people in Japan. And so all across the eastern coast from Tokyo north, you have dots of Churches of Christ that were essentially planted with rice. And what's interesting in that history, it talks about the two brothers Fox. That two Fox brothers went over and did a lot of that work. And I thought, well, I know a Fox. When I read this, and this was 2003, 14, 15 years ago, when I read that, I was like, oh, I know some Foxes. I know Nolan, I know his grandsons. And we talked about it last week. Nolan thinks he might have had some uncles that did that, but he can't remember. But let's just say they did. Until we find some verifiable proof. But needless to say, our war strategy during World War II was to burn the eastern coast of Japan. What's interesting about Nikko is it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site because in Japan is probably the densest location of shrines, temples, monuments, statues, things of significant religious importance. And I say that because on that first week in October, me and 20 of my classmates were headed to Nikko to enjoy the beauty. It was the beginning of fall, lots of deciduous trees, the leaves are starting to change, and we were going to go to this place. Nikko is known for the three monkeys, the hear no evil, speak no evil, see no evil monkeys. That's where they came from. This is a gorgeous pagoda. It's just a very gorgeous place. It's got great architecture, great art, but for the Japanese people, it is significant from a religious aspect. And on our way up there, our guide in Japan was a man by the name of Dustin Campbell. And I know my aunt and uncle know Dustin Campbell. Dustin Campbell actually went to church or grew up in Oregon, around Portland. Maybe you might have known him. I think he's currently a missionary in Ethiopia. But Dustin Campbell, on our way up there, said, you guys are going to see some beautiful things. You're going to see some great architecture. You're going to see golden statues. But I want to read a passage to you. And he opened up his Bible to Isaiah 44, and he read to us. Here's some more pictures. So let's read together Isaiah 44. From the NASB. Those who fashion a graven image are all of them futile, and their precious things are of no profit. Even their own witnesses fail to see or know, so that they will be put to shame. Who has fashioned a god or cast an idol to no profit? Behold, all his companions will be put to shame, for the craftsmen themselves are mere men. Let them assemble themselves, let them stand up, let them tremble, let them together be put to shame. The man shapes iron into a cutting tool and does his work over the coals, fashioning it with hammers and working it with his strong arm. He gets hungry. His strength fails. He drinks no water and becomes weary. Another craftsman, shapes wood. He extends a measuring line. He outlines it with red chalk. He works it with planes and outlines it with a compass. He makes it like the form of a man, like the beauty of man, so that it may sit in a house. Surely he cuts cedars for himself and takes a cypress or an oak, raises it for himself among the trees of the forest. He plants a fir, and the rain makes it grow. Then it becomes something for a man to burn. So he takes one of these trees, and warms himself. He also makes a fire to bake bread. He also makes a god and worships it. He makes it a graven image and falls down before it. Half of it he burns in the fire. Over this half he eats meat as he roasts and is satisfied. He also warms himself and says, I'm warm. I have seen the fire. But the rest of it he makes into a god, his graven image. He falls down before it and worships. He also prays to it and says, deliver me, for you are my God. They do not know, nor do they understand, for he has smeared their eyes so that they cannot see, and their hearts so they cannot comprehend. No one recalls, nor is there any knowledge or understanding to say, I have burned half of it in a fire, and also have baked bread over its coals. I roast meat and I eat it, then I make the rest into an abomination. I fall down before a block of wood. He, being the craftsman, feeds on ashes. A deceived heart has turned him aside, and he cannot deliver himself, nor say, is there not a lie in my right hand? Rarely in the Bible do we find sarcasm and ridicule like this. Think about what's been going on with Isaiah. What we've learned about in the past. God is fighting a war for the hearts and the minds of the people against idols, and he's taken the gloves off. He's not pulling his punches. He's really getting in there and saying, you guys are idiots. Don't you realize half of this you use to eat, and half of this you worship? All right. Make sure we go back to my notes so we don't miss anything. I think there's two ways to look at this passage, two ways we're going to look at it today. One is God having contempt for the idol. So God versus the idol. How do these two compare? And second, God versus the idol maker. And that's typically something we don't think about. We read this passage and we think about how much better God is to the idol, but it's something to be said how much better God is to the man that makes the idol. Okay? So, like I said, a lot of the visual imagery we're going to look at today is from Nico. This is from, if we back up, this is called Neomon. Mon is the word for gate in Japanese. There's two statues to the left and to the right. These two deities are to protect the shrine, to protect the temple complex. One typically has a hand up or open, one has a hand down. One says if you're pure, you can come in. One says if you're impure, stay out. Okay? The names of these two deities roughly translate to the beginning and the end, the Alpha and the Omega. So it's interesting. In this temple complex, we have two deities describing the Alpha and the Omega. In our experience, we have a single deity that embodies both, a single God. So, this is I think, Ungyo, and he stands on the right. I think this one actually stands on the left side. I had to flip the image to make it work with the slides. He stands on the left side of that gate. So let's talk about the futility of idols. Those who fashion a graven image, all of them are futile. Now, when I first read this, I thought, okay, futile, we're talking about the idols, that the idols are futile. That makes sense. But what Isaiah is trying to get at is the fashioners, the creators, the men and women that create idols are futile. Turn your Bibles to Genesis. What's interesting is when we read Genesis 1:2, the Hebrew word for futile used in Isaiah is used about 10 times. Just roughly 10 times. And 6 of those 10 times, it's used in the form that we see in Genesis, pertaining to creation. Okay? I've highlighted the word formless. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was formless and void. Formless is the Hebrew word tohu. Now, I'm going to mispronounce the Hebrew because I've never studied Hebrew. I'm looking at Strong's Concordance. I'm most likely going to be pronouncing Hebrew as though it was Japanese. And that's because it's really the only foreign language I've studied. The same thing happens in Spanish. When I try to speak Spanish, it sounds like Japanese. Tohu is the same word used here. I don't think that's coincidence that Isaiah is using a word that a Hebrew reader is going to recognize and associate with the creation event. Okay? The earth was formless and void. At the least, I think he's saying the value of people that create idols is even lower than the void before God spoke creation into it. How valuable was that? There was nothing there. So, at least he's saying, giving implication that the person who creates idols is valueless or has no value. At the most, I think this starts hinting at the fact we should be comparing not the idol to God, but the Creator to God. Okay? So, those who fashion a graven image, all of them are futile. Like I said, 10 occurrences. What's interesting is we see 4 of those occurrences in Isaiah. Isaiah really likes this word. We see it in Jeremiah, and like I said, we find it in Genesis 1, verse 1 through 2. Moving on. And typically, an idol fashioner is not going to fashion an idol for their own private use. They are commissioned artists. Someone's going to show up and say, you know what, I had this dream last night of a bull and it has arms outstretched, and I want you to create me an image. So the craftsman's going to go do that. The word here, witness, is almost like a commission, a person who's footing the bill for the work. Okay, that not only is it the craftsman that we're focusing on. Well, okay, let's back up. The point of this passage is for us to essentially group all the people that we're about to be sarcastic against. Okay, let's highlight the audience. Isaiah is getting together. Here's the people that we're going to be talking about. We're talking about the idol makers. We're talking about the people that commission idols. We're talking about the people that follow idols. Listen up, like it says in the last part of the verse. Let them all assemble themselves. Get together. Let them all stand up. Make yourselves known. Let them tremble. Let them be put to shame, because I'm about to throw down. That's what God's saying. So the people that make idols, the people that commission idols, the people that worship idols or follow them, get ready, because God's got words for you. Strong words for you. Okay? And then lastly, the point I want to make about this passage, the craftsmen themselves are mere men. We'll get back to this. But we begin with highlighting that they're not special. They're just mere men. The craftsmen are the people that commission, the people that worship. We're talking about mere men. All right? So, question for you guys. Why should the commissioners of these idols, why should the followers be ashamed in addition to the idol makers? Let's talk about responsibility. Yes, sir.
Well, whenever we do anything that's worthless, we're kind of ashamed of. We're proud of things we do that are accomplished.
Right.
And they have nothing to be proud of. They haven't accomplished anything.
Larry mentioned that we are typically proud when we accomplish something, and these people shouldn't be proud because they've essentially accomplished nothing. All right? Yes, George. No. No. Steve, where's Steve at? Steve, you do great work, but I don't bow to your cabinets. It's not that great. Right? It's not like God great, right? And I think that's the point we're trying to get at. Well, George, I'll answer your question. We'll get there, because I think the Isaiah is getting to a point here that answers your question specifically about craftsmen. But right, this is not we're not trying to shame everybody from ever using their hands to make something. We're getting to a deeper point. So why bring in the commissioners and the worshipers? Okay, they're the ones with the intention of it, right? No one? Guilty by affiliation, right. If you drive the getaway car, you're going to still be as guilty as the person who robbed the bank. Guilty by association. Yes? Right. Wondering about works of art. I'm not going to start burning paintings and books but there's something to be said about where our reverence lies. Right? Yes, sir? Right. Well, and let's get into that a little bit before we get to Nathan next. I work for a large software conglomerate. And what I do is I work on front ends. I don't work with back-end databases. I don't work with credit card transactions. I work with what you see day in, day out on websites. If you go to walmart.com and you were to go buy something, you're probably going to see code that I wrote. Okay? And when someone says, I've got this great idea where, you know what, that button that says buy now, when they click on it, can you just make it click it twice? That would double our revenue. Yeah, some people are going to recognize that they put, now this, of course, is not I'm not saying Walmart ever did this. Walmart, please don't sue me. I'm just saying there are black hat ideas within my industry that some people say that would increase revenue. That would improve our bottom line. If we just did this one thing, yes, people are going to make a mistake, and yes, they're going to get to the cart and realize that they ordered too many things and they're going to change their cart, but there's going to be like 10 or 20% that don't realize, and they're just going to order 2 of them, and they're going to buy 2 of them from us, and they're going to be too lazy to return them, and that's going to increase our bottom line. And me, as a Christian, as the fashioner, the craftsman of this, I have a responsibility to say, that's wrong. I can't do that. And I think that's what we're getting at. Like we said, it's a shared responsibility. Everyone is responsible. Not just the person who makes the idol, but the person who asks for it and the person who then worships it. Yes, Nate? Right. If you didn't hear Nathan, Nathan brings up a good point. Man, I'm this handsome looking because God created me this way. Right? And there's nothing I can do about it, but I'm going to take credit for it. Or my parents might take credit for it. Or my skincare company might take credit for it. Or my good marginal hygiene practices might take credit for it. But needless to say, we're not giving credit to the Creator, who in the Bible says, stitched us together in our mother's womb. Right? Yes. Right, but I agree. But I don't think the craftsman doesn't know what he's doing. He or she knows that they're creating something for worship. In fact, the first worshiper in this passage is going to be the craftsman. As soon as they're done, they're bowing to it. The final statement in the entire passage is this thing not in this is this thing in my right hand not a lie? It's going to be the craftsman. All right, so let's move on. This is the opposing deity. This is Ango. The beginning, the last one was the end. Let's read this. The man shapes iron into a cutting tool and does work over the coals, fashioning it with hammers and working it with his strong arms. He also gets hungry and his strength fails. He drinks no water and becomes weary. Another shapes wood. He extends a measuring line. He outlines it with red chalk. He works it with planes and outlines it with a compass. He makes it like the form of a man, like the beauty of man, so that it may sit in a house. Surely he cuts cedars for himself and takes a cypress or an oak and raises it for himself among the trees of the forest. He plants a fir, and the rain makes it grow. We'll come back to the second half of 12 through 17. All right, I've got a part of this verse highlighted, but there's something I forgot to mention or forgot to highlight in this verse. We talked a couple weeks ago about how with God being king, there is no council that is smart enough, wise enough to give God advice about how to rule. That's how great God is as a king. We can make the same assumption here as creator. And this is why I think Isaiah is asking us to compare the creator of idols to the creator of the world, is because this guy, the person who fashions our wooden idol, needs help from somebody else to make sharp tools. Right? God didn't need someone to come in and architect his plan. God didn't need someone to come in and sharpen his tools or sell him on a new process or procedure in order to get things done. But our idol fashioner does. Our idol fashioner, our entire story here starts out with someone else shows up, uses iron to create a sharp tool, and then our craftsman begins his work. Okay? That's the difference between our craftsman, our idol craftsman, and the creator of the universe. Just like he doesn't need counselors to rule, he doesn't need anybody else to create. Unlike our craftsman. The second thing I think that Isaiah wants us to see here is our craftsman here who's creating the tools, he gets hungry, his strength fails, he drinks water and becomes weary. During the 7 days entire creation took place, he didn't rest until it was completed. Genesis 2:2. He rested. That's why we have the Sabbath. But God didn't stop after creating the earth and said, okay, give me 2 weeks, let me catch my breath. Okay, I'm going to get back to it. That's how great God, a creator, is compared to the idol maker. The idol maker needs rest. The idol maker needs water. The idol maker needs food. And our creator needs none of those things to accomplish what he's accomplished. Questions? Thoughts? You get the point? The first reading, it feels like we're supposed to be looking at the idols. The deeper you get into this, it feels like you're supposed to be looking at the creators of the idols. Another shapes wood. He extends a measuring line. He outlines it with a red chalk. You get the idea of measure how many times? Measure twice, cut once, right? He's following good procedure. Earlier in Isaiah, and I'm taking this verse completely out of context, but to give you some background, we're talking about how God is going to completely raise the cities around Judah, how they're going to be the homes for wild animals. Isaiah uses the word, he will stretch over a line of desolation, and plumb the line of emptiness. Okay? Desolation, the same word we saw before, tohu. This is one of the 10 uses of it within the Old Testament. God can measure the void and the emptiness before creation. That's the craftsman he is. He can plumb a line of emptiness. And this guy can just measure a piece of wood. That's how much better God is as a craftsman, as a creator, to our idol creator here, our idol maker here. And then at the very end, the point I want to highlight, surely he cuts cedars for himself, takes a cypress or an oak, raises it for himself among the trees of the forest. He plants a fir, and the rains make it grow. He's depending upon God for his raw materials. If he doesn't realize that God caused that fir to grow, he's at least realizing that rain causes it to grow and God provides the rain. Make sure I get my notes before I move on to the next point. This is from Jeremiah. Some people think he's a contemporary of Isaiah, but around the same time. Here's what Jeremiah says. Are there any among the idols of the nations who give rain? Or who can the heavens grant showers? Is it not you O Lord our God. Therefore we hope in you, for you are the one who's done all these things. The God that provides rain is Yahweh. It's our God. No idol can provide rain. And so when the craftsman says, I'm going to cut down a tree this year, I'm going to plant another one and let the rains make it grow so next year I can cut down another one, they're still depending upon God to create that idol. All right, let me make sure. You did everything. Thoughts, questions before we move on to the next? Right. Okay. Nate brings up a good point. Maybe this has been poor choice of words on my part. That God has been calling this person a craftsman and not a creator. That the title should solely be true creation from nothing lies with God. Up to this point, he's been called a craftsman. Poor choice of words on my part, but great distinction made. Any other? I saw a hand up over here. Oh, yeah, Zach. Right. So these craftsmen are stealing the credit from God. They're being hypocrites, not recognizing God's contribution to their works. All right. And then this is the latter half of the verse. Then it becomes something for a man to burn. So he takes one of them and warms himself. He also makes a fire to bake bread. He makes a god and worships it. He makes it a graven image and falls down before it. Half of it he burns in the fire. Over this half he eats meat as he roasts and is satisfied. He warms himself and says, I am warm. I have seen the fire. But the rest of it he makes into a god, his graven image. He falls down before it and worships. He also prays to it and says, deliver me, for I am your God. I know there's more to this slide. Okay, we might. Let's continue on. The things to point out here. I really like. There we go. First off, the craftsman can never be free from depending on God. Second, I think it's important to note you cannot create something more powerful than yourself. Okay? These craftsmen are creating something and hoping that what they create can deliver them from their difficulties. Okay? If you can't get over your difficulties yourself, why in the world do you think you can create something and then ask it to help you get over your difficulties? Okay? It's unreasonable to expect that. The question I want to ask you, is the inverse true? If I can't get over my difficulties, is it reasonable to expect something stronger, bigger, more powerful than me, i.e. God? I'm not talking about your older brother who's always been 6 inches taller than you. I'm talking about God. Is it reasonable to expect that if I can't get over my difficulties, that turning to God, something more powerful than me, can help me get over my difficulties? I'm seeing lots of nods. I don't see a lot of people going to be arguing with that anytime soon. In the last part, we've got a little bit of time left. They do not know, nor do they understand, for he has smeared their eyes. Let's get down to the quote. I have burned half of it in the fire, and also I have baked bread over its coal, that I roast meat and eat it, that I make the rest into the abomination. I fall down before a block of wood. He feeds on ashes. Okay? It's interesting. Up at this point, we've talked about baking bread, we've talked about roasting meat, but what Isaiah wants us to realize is he's feeding on ashes. That Ashes are to bodily nutrition as idols are to spiritual nutrition. That ashes are not going to sustain your body, and idol worship is not going to sustain your soul. Okay? All right. So from an interpretation standpoint, this, I'm assuming, would probably be pretty interesting to read at the time. The contemporary is probably a good warning from the contemporary. We talk about contemporaries for our visitors as the contemporaries of Isaiah, the people in the time and place of Isaiah who might read this. What do they think? This is a good warning to stay away from idols. The exile. I see this having lots of value to the exile. When your captor asks you where your God is, what are you going to say to him? I'm not sure where my God is. What's your God made out of? Who made your God? Because I didn't make mine. Right? I think this is going to provide a lot of strength to the exile when they're starting to face idols in their captive country. What about the first century? I'm not sure what the first century would think about this. What do you think? Right. Right. So another religion, we could compare our God and his power, his ability to another God. Right. Thank you very much for your time, folks. We'll see you next week.